It seems strange to suggest any similarities between New Zealand First and ACT, but both parties are pitching for support from the same demographic. I'm joined by NBR columnist Brigitte Morten. Are they both going for the grumpy vote?
A little bit, absolutely. But I mean, a lot of people are going for the grumpy vote because there's a lot of grumpy vote to be had, I think. But I think in terms of what their particular target is, it's mostly outside of your, city centres. It's mostly male, mostly Pākehā, and mostly older.
And it's really driven off that co-governance argument, right?
Well, in one part, there's definitely that, but also you can see that particularly ACT is doing a lot of ads around the intensification policy. New Zealand First came out really strongly over the weekend and said that was one of their bottom lines. So they're really going for that as well. It's not just the co-governance.
Now, will New Zealand First, though, if it's successful, and we've seen Winston Peters do this in previous electoral cycles where come into an election year, New Zealand First support really pumps up, could it take votes away from ACT, the sort of support that ACT has been getting?
Yeah, absolutely, because I think ACT, particularly when National was in disarray, were picking up the sort of National voters that couldn't vote, didn't feel like they could vote or get behind National, and that brought a lot of the sort of ACT MPs who are currently into the House. So for them, there's a real risk that sort of that disenfranchised sort of vote gets split between them and New Zealand First.
And presumably there'll be a number of those disenfranchised voters who've voted for New Zealand First before, who also like its, I guess, economic nationalism sort of platform, perhaps less enamoured with ACT's, sort of low tax policy and things like that.
Yeah, and low intervention. I think, you can see from Winston Peters that he's much more willing to be sort of intervening in some commercial or private enterprise, things like, demanding that we have wool carpets in all public departments, that sort of thing that ACT really reviles from. So there's definitely a difference there as well. I think also for New Zealand First, though, is that it's not, they've put a platform up of what they do believe in, but they've still got to also rebuild some trust. There's a lot of people that voted for them previously. They went into government with Labour. This is the government they've got. And so he's going to have to rebuild, show basically that he wouldn't go with Labour or go down that track.
But when you actually listen to what Winston Peters says at the moment, it's hard to believe that he was ever in government with Labour.
Yeah, there does seem to be a little bit of disassociation with that period in time in terms of, I think he had a valued argument at the time was that he put a lot of handbrakes on Labour, and you can probably argue the last couple of years with them in majority, you've seen what taking that handbrake or removing it does do. But he can't, remove himself from responsibility that the Prime Minister is there because he put her there.
Well, in that 2017 election, there was talk of the three-headed monster, Labour, New Zealand First and the Greens. What's the prospect of a three-headed monster on the other side, National, ACT and New Zealand First?
It would be incredibly hard, I think, for all of them. New Zealand First and ACT, there's no love lost between Seymour and Peters. I think for National and between, how they sort of play off each other or what the demands they come to would be really difficult. Purely just in a negotiation sense, if they had to pick one over the other, it would be quite difficult. Probably naturally ACT would probably get more there. But I still think for National, that'd be a very hard government to manage.
So how should, I think Christopher Luxon hasn't been drawn on likely coalition partners at this stage, which is fair enough. We're a year away from the election, but how should National handle New Zealand First in that sense?
Well, I think this is what they need to do, is continue not being drawn on coalition partners. There was a lot of people calling for Luxon to rule in or out ACT or ACT policies in particular, or New Zealand First, or anyone, or any of those sort of new anti-government parties, should we call them. But this actually just demonstrates how quickly the landscape can change, particularly as we go into an election year. Therefore, putting all possibilities on the table, I think, is the smart thing to do and the right thing to do under MMP.
Is there any risk for the centre-right that, you get a situation where New Zealand First does reasonably well, but not enough to get 5, maybe 4%. But that's 4% vote that might have gone to ACT, if you like, and that they could then fall short. Is there...
Yeah, and you've also got you've got the Democracy New Zealand, which is Matt King's party, which has just, got registered. They could take 1.5%. The Conservatives could take another 1%. You could actually have bits and pieces there that add up to a decent chunk of the vote that then gets dispersed across everyone in Parliament, and that is definitely a risk for them.
What about the prospects, I guess, for the Opportunities Party top? They seem to have done reasonably well in the last couple of polls.
Yeah, top's a really interesting one. You know, I don't think many people thought that they could get away in basically particularly once Gareth and Morgan sort of stepped away. You know, they have been sort of tottering, or I suppose continuing to work in the background, and they've had a little bit of press over the last couple of weeks. They've clearly picked a seat. They've seen that as their pathway. Elam, which is down in Christchurch, you know, that was one of the ones that swapped to Labour very unexpectedly at the last election. It's not clear whether National Jerry Brownlee, who held it for many, many years, will be stepping up there, or who will be stepping up there. So it's definitely probably the right seat for the leader to pick. It's definitely a pathway for them. That means that they could possibly, you know, get a seat, but their party vote may not equal that.
So, I mean, if we look at the polls, I mean, at the moment, you know, you'd say that the chances, the odds are stronger on a centre-right government after the election than a centre-left. But when you throw all this in the mix, I mean, a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, I think absolutely a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of uncertainty in terms of, I think people react to polls often as well. If they think, you know, that National and Active, you know, picking a winner, getting behind them. But then if, you know, National doesn't demonstrate that they are in a position to govern going into next year, that they're not just a party of opposition, there'll probably be more votes up for, you know, around the edges.
Brigitte Morten, thank you for your time.